Unveiling the Hidden Horrors. The Dark Legacy of Slave Breeding. No one talks about the 13-year-old girl on a breeding farm who was forced to have as many babies as she could, only to have them taken away and sent to the South to live a hard life without a mother. Slave owners often had their slaves have babies so they could have more workers. The purpose of these farms was to make as many slaves as possible so that they could be sold and moved around the South. The economic necessity of slave breeding in the Cotton Kingdom. By the 1820s, a lot of planters and people who wanted to be planters moved to places that had never been settled before. They grew fiber to sell in Europe and New England, where the textile industry was starting to grow. Since 1808, when Congress stopped the U.S. from taking part in the international slave trade, planters could no longer bring in more slaves from Africa or the West Indies to help grow the so-called Cotton Kingdom. The only practical way to get more slaves to work was for more babies to be born. With so much at stake, the role of reproduction for black women became both politically and economically important. If slave mothers didn't have enough children to replace workers who got too old or died, the South couldn't keep being a slave society. For a lot of reliable sources on history, it's made to look like America had no choice but to make more slaves to make up for the good intentions behind ending the international slave trade, which Congress outlawed in 1808. Thomas Jefferson's role in protecting domestic slavery. At the time, Thomas Jefferson was president, and he didn't mind slavery. He loved his slaves so much that he didn't even let Sally Hemings go, even though she brought him 6 kids, 4 of whom grew up to be adults. Jefferson was a farmer in Virginia, so he knew how important slaves were to the economy of the South. At that time, the party he made, the Democratic-Republican Party, was in charge of Congress. They didn't stop the international slave trade to hurt slavery. Instead, they did it to protect slavery, especially domestic slavery. Congress wanted to limit the supply of slaves from other countries to keep prices high for slaves who were born and raised in the U.S. Because of what Congress did, Americans started breeding slaves. As a way to protect their business and keep the price of their product high, slave breeders asked for that to happen. Virginia, where Jefferson was born, was the state that made the most slaves. Slavery eventually became their biggest export, even more so than tobacco. Maryland was the second state to make slaves, and then several other states followed. In 1860, on farms with at least one female slave, there were twice as many women as men, according to a study by economist Richard Such. The operation and significance of slave breeding farms. In Virginia, there were more women slaves than men. They were used to breed. Robert Lumpkin ran what is mostly called a slave jail, but he also ran the largest breeding farm in the country. He himself had 5 kids with a slave named Mary. He wrote about her in his will. Even though the owners of breeding farms and plantations usually did whatever they wanted with their property, they also used selective breeding by keeping their own big bucks and bringing in big male slaves to breed good workers for the fields. Some of the first people in the country to get free health care were black female slaves. Breeders cared a lot about a woman's ability to have children, and if she didn't have more than one, her value would go down. Home medical journals were made to help with hard births, which slaves used to have to deal with on their own. In many movies, boats come into New Orleans, the largest slave market in the South before the Civil War. It's not often shown that these ships came from Richmond and Baltimore. Slaves were also sent in boxcars on the railroad or by stagecoach. Most history books don't talk about slave breeding farms, except for those that say they didn't happen. Many white slave owners thought that when they slept with their female slaves, they were doing them a favor and giving them a break from the rough black slaves they would have to deal with otherwise. In general, the house slaves were the ones who got raped the most. Some mothers had to keep their children safe from the master's wife if she thought her husband was the father. Slaves were the most important crop in states like Virginia. The financial value and commodification of slaves. The price of slaves was set by industries in other states that used slaves to make rice and sugar, as well as by the constant growth of the territory. As long as the number of slaves kept growing, breeders could count on more people wanting them and prices going up. Slaves were not only a good, but also the closest thing breeders had to money. People were hard to put a price on, so the sublets tried to show how valuable they were by giving a low estimate. In 1860, the value of all American slaves was $4 billion, which was much more than the value of gold and silver at the time. Nationwide, slaves were worth more than all the other things they could think of put together. Slaves were considered property, so their owners in the South could mortgage them to banks. The banks could then turn the mortgages into bonds and sell them to anyone, even in places where slavery was illegal. In the 1830s, wealthy slave owners in the South wanted to bring money into their state so that they could buy more slaves. They came up with a new idea that had two parts. The first part was to mortgage slaves. The second part was to turn the mortgages into bonds that could be sold all over the world. First, American planters set up new banks, usually in new states like Mississippi and Louisiana. They made lists of slaves to use as collateral, and then they mortgaged those slaves to the banks they had set up. This gave them the money to buy more slaves so they could grow cotton crops. To give the money for these loans, the bank sold bonds to investors from all over the world, including London, New York, Amsterdam, and Paris. Many of the bond buyers lived in countries where slavery was illegal and didn't have any slaves of their own. Bonds whose value was backed by their worth, and the payments he made on his mortgage paid both the interest and the principal on these bond payments. Slavery's role in the United States' economic development and global power. As historian Edward Baptist shows, slavery and its growth were key to the development and modernization of the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. This helped the U.S. become a modern, industrial, and capitalist economy. In just one lifetime, the South went from being a narrow strip of old tobacco plantations along the coast to being a subcontinental cotton empire. By 1861, it had 5 times as many slaves as it did during the Revolution and made 2 billion pounds of cotton a year. Slavery made the United States a powerful country, almost as strong as England. It was the only way for the U.S. to grow cotton, which was vital for the Industrial Revolution. By the end of the 18th century, it was common for slaves to have their own children. This was mostly because of laws and practices that changed people's views of slaves from people to property. So, slaves could be bought and sold as property without going against the religion and social norms of society as a whole. All rights belonged to the slave's owner, and the slave had no right to choose his or her own life, spouse, or children. People who owned slaves started to think that slavery was based on the Bible. This view was partly based on a person's interpretation of a passage in Genesis. He said that Cursive became a servant of servants to his brothers, and that Ham, son of Noah and father of Canaan, was thought to be the ancestor of the African people from before the flood. Some white people used the Bible to explain why slave labor is good for business. Slave owners thought it was their right to make slaves work for them. The slave's second-class status didn't just apply to his relationship with his slave master, it also applied to all white people. Slaves were thought to be under the control of white people. America barely acknowledges that breeding farms existed, let alone how they helped the South's economy grow in the early 1800s. There are some horrible truths in the Declaration of Independence that must be hidden and forgotten at all costs. The second group is made up of breeding farms. The history books, when they talked about slave breeding at all, said that it didn't start until after the Atlantic slave trade ended. In fact, it began on plantations and farms decades earlier. America stopped bringing slaves from Africa when it could make enough slaves to meet its own needs. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Bazaar, for more captivating tales from history.